She never told her students about the soup, never mentioned the quiet drive, or the man waiting by the window every Thursday evening. Julia Palmer just brought warmth and left before anyone could say thank you. But one morning, on her birthday, the school doors opened and 15 Marines in full uniform walked into her classroom. Not to teach, not to recruit, but to honor the woman who reminded their old commander that he still mattered. This is the story of a quiet act that echoed farther than anyone could have imagined. Welcome to Grateful Stories, where tales of compassion and kindness are told. Let's uncover what really happened. Asheville, North Carolina. Stirred gently in the early evening light, the streets began to quiet as school buses emptied and porch lights flickered on one by one. But in a modest yellow house just past Maple Avenue, the kitchen windows glowed with something else entirely purpose. Inside, Julia Palmer stood over a pot of simmering soup. She moved with quiet rhythm. Her sleeves rolled, her apron dusted lightly with flour. Steam rose in delicate curls as she stirred, tasting, adjusting, tasting again. Chicken and wild rice, just the way he liked it. It was Thursday, and Thursday meant soup. At 31, Julia Palmer led what most would call a simple life. She taught third grade at Blue Ridge Elementary. Just outside town, she lived alone, in the same house her mother left her. She didn't travel much, didn't go out much either, but she gave quietly, consistently. Every Thursday after school, Julia loaded 2 mason jars of homemade soup into a cloth-lined basket, along with a folded napkin and a single slice of cornbread wrapped in foil. And then she drove 22 minutes down Route 16 to Hillcrest Veterans Care Center to visit one man, Walter Briggs. She never told her students, never mentioned it in staff meetings or shared photos on social media. To her, it wasn't a story, it was a responsibility. A small thread in a larger fabric she couldn't quite name, but felt deeply. Walter Briggs was 87, a retired Marine Corps lieutenant colonel who had once commanded men across oceans. Now he sat in a second-floor room that overlooked a patch of oak trees in a quiet parking lot. No family, no visitors, no birthdays on the calendar, just silence, broken only by the occasional shuffle of nurses or the hum of the evening news. The first time Julia met him, it was almost by accident. She had volunteered to deliver meal trays during her school's community week. Walter was the only one who didn't want his, said he wasn't hungry, said the food was always cold, but something in his voice would made her pause. She returned the next day, not with a tray, but with a mason jar. The soup had still been warm when he opened it. His hands, tremoring slightly, had gripped the lid like it was something sacred. That was 7 months ago. He hadn't missed a Thursday since. Julia pulled into the Hillcrest lot just before 6. The sun was fading behind the Blue Ridge Mountains, casting a soft gold over the treetops. She turned off the engine and reached for the basket beside her, checking the lids one more time. Then she walked slowly up the path, nodding to the front desk nurse, and took the stairs instead of the elevator like she always did. Walter's room was at the end of the hallway. She didn't knock anymore, just paused gently before entering. "Evening, Colonel," she said softly, stepping into the room. Walter Briggs was already sitting up, his gray sweater tucked neatly, his cap resting on the nightstand beside him. He didn't smile, but he did nod. "Once, Palmer," he greeted. That was all. No long pleasantries, no drawn-out small talk, just that quiet rhythm they had fallen into. She set the basket down on the small table by the window, began unpacking the meal slowly. The room smelled faintly of antiseptic and old wood, but soon the scent of warm broth softened the air. Walter waited until she placed the soup in front of him. He ate slowly, methodically, the way soldiers learn to do when rations are scarce and time is borrowed. They rarely talked much. Julia would sit across from him in the corner chair, sipping from her thermos or folding napkins while he ate. Sometimes he'd ask how school was going. Sometimes he'd comment on the weather. But most of the time, they just sat, quiet, present, and in that quiet, something deeper lived, something both of them seemed to need. Julia never asked Walter about his service. She never needed to. There were medals on the wall, neatly framed and dusted, a silver star, a purple heart, a Marine Corps flag folded in glass, a black and white photo of a much younger Walter standing in front of a tank in Korea. What could she say? What could anyone say to a man who'd already lived 5 lifetimes in one, sometimes? She'd glance up and catch him watching her, not in a way that asked for anything, but in a way that quietly acknowledged the world hadn't forgotten him entirely. And that, for Walter, was enough. As Walter finished the last bite of cornbread, he set the spoon down with care. He didn't speak right away. Just looked out the window for a long moment. Julia followed his gaze. The trees were still, dark silhouettes against the fading light. "Shepherd's soup," he said quietly. Julia turned back to him. "Sir, my wife used to make soup like that. When I first came home from Nam, she said it settled the heart before it settled the stomach." Julia didn't reply. She just nodded. Walter never mentioned his wife before, never mentioned anyone, really. It was the first time she'd heard him say something that sounded close, personal. He didn't say anything more, and she didn't ask. At 6:42, Julia began packing up the basket. Walter leaned back in his chair, hands folded across his lap. His eyes, normally sharp and unreadable, looked softer in the evening light. As Julia opened the door to leave, he spoke again low, almost like a thought said aloud. "Thank you for not asking why." She paused, turned halfway. "I never needed to," she replied, and with that, she left. The hallway echoed with her steps as she made her way back to the parking lot. Outside, the sky had gone dark. Julia sat in her truck for a moment, fingers resting lightly on the steering wheel. She could have gone home, turned on the TV, graded spelling tests, but instead, she sat there, still, thinking about Walter Briggs, thinking about her own father, also a Marine, gone when she was 9. She still remembered the sound of his boots on the hardwood floor, the way he used to hum low songs in the kitchen while heating leftovers. She remembered how, after the funeral, people brought casseroles and flowers, and then nothing. No more stories, no more visits. No one ever really asked what it felt like to grow up in the echo of a uniform. Maybe that's why she showed up every Thursday. Maybe that's why she made the soup from scratch. It wasn't just about Walter. It was about honoring what had gone silent in her own life. Julia started the engine. The headlights lit up the gravel drive. She didn't see it coming, not then. Not what this small act of quiet kindness would set in motion. But deep in the quiet, something had begun. And by the time her next birthday arrived, everything would change. The weeks moved quietly, the way late winter tends to move in a place like Asheville. Soft skies, muffled mornings. Julia kept coming. Every Thursday, basket in hand, soup carefully packed, cornbread wrapped warm in a towel. But it wasn't just the soup that changed with the seasons. Walter was changing too. She noticed it the first week of February. He had shaved, not just a trim, but a clean, deliberate shave, the kind a man gives himself when he's expecting company. His usual gray stubble was gone, and in its place, a weathered jawline she hadn't seen before. There was a fresh towel folded on the nightstand. The room smelled faintly of aftershave and lemon polish. She didn't say anything, just smiled as she set the basket down on the tray. But Walter, with his usual dry tone, raised an eyebrow. "You're early," he muttered, easing himself into his chair. Julia glanced at the clock on his dresser. 4 minutes. That hardly counts. He didn't respond, but the corner of his mouth lifted just enough. That Thursday, he ate slower. He talked more. Not about the war, not about medals or battles or names that history books forgot, but about books. He told her he'd started reading again, said he found an old journal in the back of his closet, a leather one with a cracked spine and yellowed pages. "My handwriting was better back then," he said, poking at his cornbread. "You wrote during the war?" Julia asked. Walter nodded. "Off and on. Mostly after missions. Just notes. Nothing poetic. You ever think about finishing it?" He shook his head. What for? She didn't press. Just sat quietly while he sipped his soup. But something about the way he looked at that journal, it stayed with her. The next Thursday, the change was more obvious. The room was tidier, blankets folded, books stacked. Even the blinds were pulled open, letting in the last light of a fading sun. Julia noticed a photo frame on the side table that hadn't been there before. It showed a young Marine, broad shoulders, square jaw, full dress uniform. Walter, decades ago, standing on a stone platform somewhere overseas, flanked by a line of men, younger than him, looking up with that unmistakable expression soldiers wear when they trust the one in front. She picked it up gently. "Were you there, CO Walter?" Adjusting the buttons on his sweater. Didn't answer right away. "I stood in front of a lot of people," he said finally. "Issued orders, signed in letters home." His voice was soft, distant. But that was another world. One where people listened. Julia looked at the photo again, then back at the man sitting across from her. "I think some people still would," she said. Walter didn't reply, but he didn't change the subject either. And that, from him, meant something. She didn't need to know more. Julia had learned long ago the loudest heroes rarely spoke of what they'd done. They just carried it, and sometimes they just needed someone to sit with them while they did. One Thursday in early March, things didn't go as planned. Julia's car didn't start. The battery had been giving her trouble for weeks. And that morning, rushing out of school with the basket in one hand and keys in the other, it finally gave out. She called the nursing home, apologized, said she'd be late. 35 minutes later, she pulled into the Hillcrest parking lot, hair damp from the drizzle, heart racing with guilt. She hurried down the hall, shoes squeaking slightly on the linoleum. When she opened Walter's door, he was already seated, upright, waiting. She froze for a moment, catching her breath. "Sorry I'm late," she said, setting the basket down. Walter didn't scowl, didn't sigh. He just glanced at the clock on the wall. Then, with a dry grin, said, "I figured I'd been forgotten." Julia laughed nervously, but something in his voice stopped her. Not what he said, but how he said it. It wasn't sarcasm. It wasn't bitterness. It was something quieter, almost expectant. She looked at him, really looked. His hands were folded, but tight. His jaw set a little too firm, like he'd been sitting there wondering whether Thursday had finally stopped meaning something to someone. "I'd never forget you," she said gently. Walter looked away, out the window. "I know," he murmured, barely audible song, "but the world does." Julia sat down across from him. They didn't say much during the meal, but she saw it. The way his eyes flicked to the door every time someone walked by. The way he leaned slightly forward when she unpacked the soup as if making sure it was really happening. That night, when she returned home, she didn't turn the TV on. She didn't start grading spelling tests or respond to emails from parents asking why their child got a C on math. Instead, she sat at the edge of her couch and cried. Not loud, not messy, just quiet tears that came from a place she didn't fully understand, because something inside her had broken a little. And it wasn't the car battery. It was the realization that if she hadn't shown up, there would have been no one. No one to ask if Walter had eaten. No one to wonder why his lights stayed off. No one to remember that he had once stood before men with medals and weight and war in his voice, and that now he just waited for soup on Thursdays. Julia cried until the tea in her mug went cold. Then she got up, took out a fresh notebook, and began writing down every detail she could remember about Walter Briggs. His stories, his habits, the way he folded his napkin twice before eating. She didn't know why, only that somehow someone needed to remember him. And if that someone had to be her, then so be it. Because she'd made a silent promise the first time she walked into that room. No one gets left behind, not on her watch. The morning of March 23rd began like any other Thursday. Julia arrived early to straighten the reading corner before her students shuffled in, sleepy-eyed and full of chatter about field trips and weekend plans. She wrote the date on the whiteboard with her usual calm smile, then tucked a strand of hair behind her ear, ignoring the number staring back at her. March 23rd, her birthday, She hadn't told anyone, not her students, not her colleagues, not even the front desk staff who always seemed to remember these things. It wasn't that she didn't care, she just didn't need it. Julia never liked being the center of attention, never wanted a cake in the break room or a card passed around with obligatory signatures. She preferred quiet mornings, warm coffee, and doing her job well. And besides, there was soup to make that evening. The first bell rang at 8 a.m. sharp, and the third graders filed in, buzzing with energy. Morning, Miss Palmer. Guess what? I lost my tooth. I saw a frog outside the cafeteria. She smiled, listening to it all. This was her rhythm, her place, her kind of celebration. By 8:15, they were reviewing multiplication tables. Julia stood at the front, holding a whiteboard marker in one hand and a laminated flashcard in the other. Okay, class, what's 6 times 7? A sea of hands flew up. 84, one girl shouted too early. Julia laughed gently. Almost. That's 6 times knock. Knock. The sound stopped her mid-sentence. She turned toward the door, expecting the school secretary or maybe a parent who'd forgotten to sign a permission slip. But the knock came again, firmer this time. Strange. She walked to the door and opened it. And for a moment, just one still, breathless moment, Julia Palmer forgot how to breathe. 15 men stood in the hallway. 15 Marines, dressed in full formal uniform, pressed blues, gleaming metals, crisp caps. Their boots were polished, their faces solemn, and at their center stood a tall, broad-shouldered man with silver at his temples and the unmistakable poise of someone used to giving orders. The hallway had gone silent. So had the classroom. Julia blinked, her hand still resting on the doorframe. Ms. Julia Palmer, the man asked, his voice low but steady. She nodded slowly. Yes, that's me. The man gave a small nod to the others behind him. And then one by one they stepped into the classroom. It wasn't loud. It wasn't rushed. It was ceremonial, deliberate. The children sat frozen at their desks, wide-eyed and whispering. The commander walked to the front, stopping just before Julia, who hadn't moved an inch. In his hands, a bouquet of red and white flowers, wrapped in simple brown paper. Tucked into the stems, a card. Balanced on his other palm, a white pastry box. He held them out with the kind of reverence usually reserved for folded flags and final salutes. On behalf of our unit, he said, and in the name of a man we love like family, we're here to say happy birthday. Julia stared. He continued, quieter now. Lieutenant Colonel Walter Briggs asked us to find you, to thank you, to stand for him in the place he couldn't. Julia's eyes filled instantly. The room blurred around the edges. The bouquet trembled slightly as she reached out to take it. Her fingers brushed the edge of the card, plain, white, handwritten in thick black ink. You didn't ask for anything, but you gave everything. She opened her mouth to speak, but nothing came out. A small voice behind her whispered, Hush, Palmer, do you know them? Julia turned slightly. It was Ethan, the quiet boy with a chipped front tooth and a heart too big for his frame. His hand was lifted, palm upward, like he was offering something invisible support. Maybe steadiness. Julia let out a soft, shaky breath, then nodded once. I do. The commander stepped aside, and the other Marines followed in 2 neat rows spreading out along the walls, nodding to the students, who were still frozen in wide-eyed silence. One of them, young, clean-shaven, maybe 25, placed the pastry box gently on Julia's desk. A small candle sat atop it, unlit, still wrapped in foil. Inside, a simple vanilla cake, topped with white icing, and the words, Happy Birthday, Ms. Palmer, written in careful cursive. No logos, no bakery branding. Handmade. Julia pressed a hand to her chest. The card still clutched tightly in the other. Her voice returned only as a whisper. Why? Why would he do this? The commander stepped closer. Because you gave him something most people stopped giving long ago. He paused. Time, dignity, presence. He glanced around the room. These children will read about men like Walter Briggs in textbooks someday. But you made sure he didn't vanish before the chapter even began. One of the Marines, older, more weathered, added quietly, "He was our CO, our compass. We owe him everything." Julia's knees trembled slightly. She sat down slowly in her chair as the class stirred again, small voices rising in cautious awe. "Are they real soldiers? Is this a surprise party? Can I take a picture?" The Marines smiled. One of them gently waved his hand to quiet the room. "We're not here for a parade," he said. "We're here because someone showed quiet kindness. And we believe that kind of courage deserves a salute." He turned toward Julia. Then slowly, precisely, he raised his right hand. A full, formal military salute. One by one, the others followed. 15 hands, 15 salutes, 15 silent thank yous from men who had seen the world break apart and had found in Julia Palmer something strong enough to hold it together. Julia didn't try to stop the tears anymore. She let them fall, not because she felt seen, but because someone else had. Walter, the man the world had nearly forgotten, had remembered her and sent 15 reminders to make sure she never forgot him either. And in that quiet third-grade classroom in front of 22 children, a chalkboard, and a crooked U.S. flag pinned above the doorframe, Julia Palmer received the highest honor she'd ever been given. Not a medal, not a certificate, but a room full of soldiers showing up for her. The week after the Marines visited Julia's classroom, the world seemed a little quieter. Students still asked questions. Parents still sent snack notes. Life didn't stop, but something had shifted. In Julia's heart, in the air around her, it wasn't loud or dramatic. It was something else deeper, like the hush that settles after a church bell stops ringing. 3 days later, she visited Hillcrest. She didn't bring soup that day, just herself, and a card tucked inside her coat pocket, written in the handwriting of 22 third graders, still sticky with glitter glue and construction paper hearts. Walter was waiting in the common room, sunlight spilling through the blinds across his lap. He sat in a wheelchair, now his legs stiff, his posture slightly hunched, but his eyes still sharp as ever. When Julia walked in, he smiled. Not the quiet, closed-lip grin she'd seen before, but a full, weathered smile. The kind of smile that only comes after a long silence finally breaks. She walked over, sat beside him. Walter looked at her, eyes twinkling. "First birthday party I've had in 20 years, he said. "Funny thing is, it wasn't even mine." Julia laughed gently, shaking her head. "You organized all that." He shrugged, slowly. "I made a call to a friend, one of my old captains. Still works near Camp Lejeune. Told him about you, about the soup, the silence, the Thursdays." She blinked. "But how did they get the school address?" Walter tilted his head. "Turns out Marines are very good at logistics." They both laughed. But behind the humor, Julia felt something else stir. A weight, a knowing. "Why did you do it?" she asked softly. Walter turned to the window, watching the wind press against the trees outside. "Because you reminded me I hadn't disappeared yet," he said. "You saw me, every week, without asking for anything back." He paused. "I wanted to leave something behind that wasn't just paperwork, something that felt like breath." Julia's eyes stung. He reached into the blanket on his lap and pulled out a small envelope, handed it to her. "No soup tonight," he said. "Just this." She took it, but didn't open it. Not yet. They sat for a while in silence, and when she left, Walter said one last thing, his voice thinner, but no less steady. "You gave me a reason to shave again." She didn't cry until she reached the parking lot. Weeks passed. Spring stretched its arms across the Blue Ridge foothills. Pink dogwoods bloomed near the school playground. Julia's students studied state capitals in cursive letters. And then, one Thursday afternoon, a package arrived. Not at the school, at her front door. No return address. Just a navy blue envelope stamped with the seal of the United States Navy. Inside, a formal letter, thick paper, gold foil at the top, to Miss Julia Palmer, in grateful recognition of your contributions to veteran reintegration and your acts of consistent civilian compassion, you are hereby awarded the Honorary Civilian Service Certificate of Commendation by order of the Commander, U.S. Marine Forces Command. Julia sat at her kitchen table for a long time, hands resting on the edge of the paper. There were no cameras, no ceremony, just a quiet truth someone had noticed. Someone other than Walter. She framed the certificate in a wooden frame she found at the thrift store, hung it beside her fridge, next to a crayon drawing of a dinosaur wearing a cape. Both meant the world to her. 2 months later, Walter Briggs passed away, peacefully, in his sleep. The staff at Hillcrest called Julia before they called anyone else. There were no next of kin, no family listed, just one name under emergency contact: Julia Palmer. She helped plan the service, picked the hymn, brought lilies instead of roses because Walter once mentioned his wife used to grow them. The chapel was small, modest, but not empty. 3 rows of Marines came in uniform. 2 nurses from Hillcrest stood near the back, holding tissues. Julia sat in the front row. On her lap rested a folded journal, leather-bound, worn at the edges. The nurses had found it in Walter's room, laid gently on his bed with a note inside, to the teacher who brought soup on Thursdays. Inside, his handwriting deliberate, fading with time, but strong. Stories, memories, battles, laughter, regrets. And on the first page, written in capital letters for Julia Palmer, the one who stayed. That night, she read every word, not because she wanted to know more about the war, but because she needed to know the man who had once stood before it. Walter Briggs wasn't forgotten. Not anymore. Years passed. The world kept turning. Julia kept teaching. The students kept coming and going. One afternoon in late May, a letter arrived in her school mailbox. It was from a name she hadn't seen in years. Nathaniel Carter, one of her 3rd grade students from long ago. She remembered him as the boy who always wore 2 big sneakers and drew fighter jets in the margins of his math test. The letter was short, neat, typed on Navy stationery. Dear Miss Palmer, today I took my oath. Next week I ship out. Before I go, I wanted you to know something. I didn't join the Navy because of war stories or movies or medals. I joined because I once saw 15 Marines walk into your classroom and salute you. Because I saw your hands shake as you held a card and didn't say a word. Because you never told us to respect people. You just showed us how. Thank you for seeing the man the rest of the world forgot. Thank you for letting us see you do it. With respect, Seaman Recruit Nathaniel Carter. Navy. Julia read the letter once, then again, then folded it quietly and placed it inside Walter's journal, right beside the page where he had written her name. She closed the book gently, stood up, and looked out the classroom window. The flagpole outside swayed in the wind. The bell rang, somewhere down the hallway, and 3rd graders came running down the corridor, laughing, shouting, tripping over shoelaces and backpacks. Julia smiled, because the world never stops moving. But sometimes, when you're lucky, it remembers the quiet ones who kept showing up. In our darkest moments, kindness still finds a way. Often in the quietest places. Not everyone who helps wants recognition. Some just need to know that today, someone isn't going hungry. And sometimes, that alone is enough to change a life. You may forget the story, but if no one retells it, history stays silent forever. Subscribe to Grateful Stories, where justice is honored, kindness is remembered, and no act of quiet heroism is ever lost.